reading from the book of Luke, the 6th chapter, beginning with the 43rd verse. No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes, or grapes from briars. The good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For out of the overflow of his heart, his mouth speaks. Now, my mom grew up in a denomination that was big on what is called worm theology. Now, consider yourself lucky if you've never heard of worm theology, but if you've ever seen a songbook from the 18th century, when you turn to Amazing Grace and you read the first line, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a worm like me. Now, our hymn book says wretch. It's a little better than a worm. A lot of hymn books say man, which my mom reminded me is not better than wretch, because she would, as a woman, she said she'd rather be called a wretch than a man. But worm theology focuses on the utter depravity of humanity. In the 17th century, one of the great American preachers wrote a sermon. I had to read it in high school, called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he describes us being like a spider on the end of a string that's been picked up and is being held over the fire. And is the person holding the spider over the fire going to drop it into the fire or not? So, the whole idea being we are completely unworthy of God. We can do nothing good. Now, there's truth to this theology. Like most things that are wrong, there's a grain of truth to it. In our sinful state, it's a fairly accurate description. John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, considered himself to have been one of the greatest sinners imaginable because he was the captain of a slaving ship who went to Africa and kidnapped people and brought most of them over to America. I say most because about a fourth of them always died on the way in horrible conditions. And once he was convicted of his sin, he called himself a worm. I'm no better than a worm. I'm not worth any more than that. And there's truth because without Christ, that's what we are. The problem is that this is a theology for the unsaved. And we kind of forgot that. And so often it gets brought into a theology for all, saved and unsaved. But something happens when we're saved. That's not, that unworthiness, that worm nature of us is no longer accurate. not even sure how accurate it is beforehand, but I'll get to that in a minute. Now, it's also true that we cannot make ourselves worthy. But we don't have to. And that's a very important part of the whole thing. My children cannot earn my love. But they've never had to earn my love. It's not that, well, you just can't do enough. It's, you don't have to. We can never earn God's love, but we don't have to earn God's love. It's not that we were sinners and then we accepted Christ and then God loved us. It was, we were sinners, God loved us, then we accepted Christ. You see the difference? Paul puts it this way. He said, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Now, if God didn't love us while we were sinners, would Christ have died for us while we were sinners? We look at our lives before we knew Christ and we go, I was a terrible person. I was a worm. And then we go a step further and go, God couldn't love me. I was so bad, God, even God couldn't love me. God looked at us and he looked beyond our sin. And he loved us while we were yet sinners. And God looked at us and he loved us so much that he sent his only Son, that whoever believed in him would not perish, but have eternal life. And God sent his Son to die on the cross for worms, for sinners, because God did not see us as worms. First of all, God created us. And when God created us, God looked at us and God said, it is good. And when he created humans in particular, he said, it is very good. So we've already started with something good. I remember when my brother and I were walking with my parents one time, and we're walking down the street, and I look over in the gutter, and there's a dollar bill. Now, it is dirty. It had been caught in a storm, and then the mud had dried on it. But I look at it, and I don't see the mud and the dirt. I see a dollar bill. And I reach down and I pick it up. And my brother goes, ew! What do you want that for? I go, it's a dollar bill. And my mom turned to my brother and said, what's wrong with you? Afraid to get your hands dirty for a dollar bill? He looked at it and it was a little torn on the edges and wrinkled and dirty. And to him it was worthless. It wasn't even worth taking the time to bend down and pick it up. I straightened that bill out a little bit, kind of brushed it off. I took it to the store, and you know what? They took it at the store. And they gave me $1 worth of candy. That bill still had worth, even though it was dirty. That's how God looked at us as sinners. Yeah, you may be dirty. Yeah, you may even be a little disgusting. I don't want to touch that. But the worth is still there. The value is still there. God's love for us was still there. Jesus is telling us here in this little parable that we still have worth. Because he talks about a good man. Well, that flies in the face of worm theology, which says nobody is good. Why would God say there's such a thing as a good man if there isn't? We are worthy. You are worthy in God's eyes. Even when you were at the depths of your sin, the most sinful you've ever been in your life, God looked at you and said, I love you. God looked at you and said, you are worth Christ dying on the cross for. Now, I don't know how we can say that Christ died for us and we're still unworthy. If nothing else makes us worthy, it is Christ's sacrifice that makes us worthy. Where did this whole idea of worm theology come from anyway? Well, as far as I'm concerned, it came from Satan. Jesus says of Satan that he is a liar and the father of lies. Now, one of his greatest lies comes from the beginning. When he convinces Adam and Eve to eat the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, which leads them to do what? When God comes to talk to them, they hide. Because they're naked. Because they're ashamed. Because they look at themselves and look at God and say, we're not worthy to be in God's presence, so they hide. Now, God didn't come and say, oh, I know what you've done, you ate the apple. God doesn't even show up and say, what have you done? Adam says, we heard you coming and we hid because we were naked. And God said, well, who told you that? How do you know that you're naked? You shouldn't know that. But it's not just about being naked. What Adam is saying is we looked at ourselves and we decided we had to hide from God. We decided that we weren't worthy to be in God's presence. And God's question for Adam and Eve is a question for us today. Who told you that? I remember with James when he was going to public school and he comes home and he tells me something and I go, something stupid. I don't even remember what it was, but it was stupid. And he goes, guess what? And he tells me what it says. And I go, who told you that? Why do you believe that? Think that, why do you believe that you're not worthy of God's love? It was God's decision to love you. You must be worth it. If for no other reason than God created you and God said, you are mine. God doesn't hang on to junk. We do. I like the show Forged in Fire. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's a forging competition, and they have to make knives or other weapons. But one of the lines I got from one of the Smiths is, never keep going with a mistake just because you spent a lot of time making it. Now, as a Smith, what he's saying is there comes a time when you need to trash your project and start over. God's not that way with us. Might have been easier for God if he'd chosen to. Well, they blew it. I'm going to have to try again. It's not coming out the way I want it. But God looked at us at our worst and said, I can fix that. I can work with that. I love that. We are worthy, not because of anything we've done, not because of who we are. We are worthy because of who God is and what he has done. Our closing hymn is number 430.